All right. Good morning, good morning, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Happy Friday. You are in the right place if you are here for the Equity and Inclusion Speaker Series. Thank you to the Training and Development Department, Debbie Andrews, and the MCC Tech team, specifically Brian. You could be several places today, virtually or in person, but we are so glad that and thankful that you are here. I have the esteemed pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, who's not a stranger to MCC or Omaha. Dr. Marcy Vandiver was proudly raised in Omaha, where she attended Picote Elementary School, Beveridge Middle, and Marion High Schools. Currently, she is an associate professor of education at Towson University in Baltimore County, Maryland. She received her Bachelor of Science degree in middle grades education from Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. After her undergraduate studies, she worked for Atlanta Public Schools in an alternative middle school as an alternative middle school teacher and received her master's degree in educational policy and leadership from Georgia State University. She later received her PhD in curriculum and instruction, urban education from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Her research interest explores various intersections of Black education to include resistance pedagogy, historical and contemporary issues in urban education, and transformative emancipatory learning. She is married to Reverend Kevin Vandiver, and they have one son. I present to some and introduce to others Dr. Marcy Vandiver. Marcy?
Hi, everyone. It's very nice to meet you in this virtual space. I'm going to share my presentation in a second, but I just want to thank Dr. Gooch Grayson and Ms. Trotter, of course, who I have known since I was a little girl, but have always embraced who I have become professionally, and that is I teach in Baltimore. I teach college kids how to be teachers. And within that work, I do a lot of equity work, inclusion work, trying to make sure that we extend opportunities for everyone, the chance to speak and be heard. So thank you so much for being here. I do miss Omaha. I just had a son 8 months ago, almost 9 months ago. And I was just telling Dr. Gooch Grayson before you all were let in that I really want to bring him to the zoo once he turns 1. So he'll be 1 in March. After then, I want to come to the zoo. I miss Godfather's Pizza. I miss Runza. I miss, what else? Those are the 2 big ones. Timeout Chicken. So I can't wait to be back in Omaha soon, hopefully in 2022 for sure. So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to get started. And I hope this can be a discussion, a dialogue. We'll have questions at the end. It doesn't mean I'll have all the answers, but we could definitely talk about this messy but important work. Thumbs up if you can see my screen. Thumbs up, thumbs up, thumbs up. If my internet goes in and out, I live on a college campus. So campus internet, I don't know if you all have this problem at Metropolitan Community College, but campus internet sometimes is spotty. So if I get lost, I'll log right back in. So the title of my presentation is May the Force Be With You, Equity, Mindedness, and Classroom Instruction. We will talk about why I chose that title soon, but you are in the right place, as Dr. Gooch Grayson mentioned. So really quick, raised in Omaha, I already said that. I taught in Atlanta Public Schools. I taught in the alternative school system. So I am a certified teacher in Georgia. I always extend my teaching certificate, like when it's about to expire, I always take a class or something to extend it, because I do believe remaining relevant with kids with classroom instruction is important. So I am still a certified teacher. I went to Mercer for undergrad, Georgia State, and Atlanta for my master's, and then my PhD in North Carolina. That is also where I met my husband and moved away. I teach at Towson, which is in Baltimore County, which was mentioned in my bio. I teach college students how to be teachers, and the courses that I teach are urban education. So Baltimore, and we know this from pop culture, The Wire, is over 66% low income and predominantly Black. Towson, however, is in the suburbs. It's in Baltimore County, and for good and bad reasons, they pride themselves on being in the county. It's like a distancing almost from the city. And so many of our students are white. They teach in primarily Black spaces. And so I teach how to bring yourself, your authentic self, how to be a good teacher, regardless of color, how to be a good teacher with classrooms that often may not look like you, which I think is really important. I think good teaching is not indicative of race. Some of my best teachers, I had some at Picot, some at Beveridge, I had a language arts teacher at Beveridge, Miss Skinner. And then Marion, yes, some of my best teachers did not look like me, some did. And so it's how do I make sure that our college students who will enter the classroom are good teachers. And then I also teach history, which is fun. How do I teach history? How do I get college kids to teach history in a multicultural way to make sure that all perspectives, not just dominant perspectives, are heard in history classrooms? So that is the lens through which I do a lot of equity work such as this. So this is what we're going to do today. We're going to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're going to talk about what Star Wars has to do with any of this. And then we're going to talk about some critical needs that we should think about as higher education professionals. And then we'll leave with some practical tips and advice just for you to kind of put in your pocket, think about. Many of us are in different departments, capacities, but we all are transformative professionals, meaning we have the ability to transform lives or at least impact lives. If you don't like dramatic language, we have the ability to impact students' lives and the community around us. So how do we use some tips, take some tips, and be transformative in the ways that we can? So I'm going to start off with this. So what does Star Wars have to do with equity and inclusion? And I'm going to answer that very shortly, but I want you to kind of think about that in the back of your mind. Think about maybe what it has to do with. It's a trick question. So I'm going to show you 4 pictures, and we're going to pick apart some problems that I have seen in diversity and inclusion work. And like I said, I do this work at my university. I do this with various nonprofits. I'm doing this at 3 o'clock Eastern time with another nonprofit. This work is important. And I think a lot of things that are happening in the world cause us to think about how can we make sure that different voices are heard. So I often show this picture. This picture, if everyone can see it, is diverse. This picture is diverse. You see children in the bottom right corner. I see people of different races in the front. I even see livestock and people. I see livestock in the back. I see people of different genders, assumably. This is a diverse picture. And I often show this because the focus on diversity work, I often joke with my students, hearing the word diversity often is not enough. Like, you can be diverse, you can have a diverse group of people, but it does not mean that it's an environment that you should want to be in. It's an environment that's inclusive. It's one that extends belonging. It's one that extends equal power to everyone. So hearing, oh, my company is diverse, my department is diverse, my classroom is diverse, is not enough. And I think this is just a great starting point. This was a painting done, I think, in like 1919 that describes just it's a Southern plantation. I think it's a Texas plantation, if that matters to you. And you see refineries in the back as well, which is also popping up, which even extends even more historical diversity, if you're thinking about that. So thinking about diversity, the first thing I would leave you with is just think about this picture. Diversity is not enough. You can be diverse. This picture is very diverse. It's a great representation of diversity, in fact, but it does not mean that that is an environment that we should strive for if that is all we're doing. And hopefully everyone can parse out what I'm saying. If that is all we're doing, if the buck stops right here, this is not enough. Okay, so that's diversity. We're going to pick apart everything. The next thing is inclusion. Inclusion. This picture shows inclusive spaces within education. I used to have one of these pictures as my computer backdrop. I love the history of Brown v. Board and post-segregation schools. I love it. I've written about it. I was involved in something called Freedom Schools, if anyone knows about the Children's Defense Fund, or Freedom Summer, if anyone knows history. I love this time period in history. But this picture, these two pictures actually, are inclusive. As we know, Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 determined that separate but equal spaces were unconstitutional. So if I say that's unconstitutional, then that means that you now have to invite other people that don't look like you into your classrooms. And this happened. It took 10 years for it to happen, but around 1965, we started to see actual Black students entering white spaces. And you hear things like Ruby Bridges or the Little Rock Nine, famous people in history that helped to integrate schools. If you look at these pictures, we see from just their phenotypes, just from what they look like, there are diverse students in this classroom space. In comparison to the first picture that I showed, they're not on a plantation, they are in an actual school. So it looks like this is something that's inclusive. But we know that just being inclusive by definition, just saying, oh, we're inclusive, I'm including you into my space now. There are still loopholes with that if we know from these pictures that there was not equitable treatment among students. When Brown versus Board of Education happened, if you want to know a history bit, so Brown versus Board of Education basically demanded a Supreme Court mandate, that Black students and white students, or just students of all races actually, could no longer be segregated based on race. But within that court decision, so many other things happened. When those children, when Ruby Bridges, the Little Rock Nine, I'm involved in a documentary in Baltimore, where there were 7 students who integrated Baltimore schools. That doesn't mean the treatment was nice, kind. It does not mean that they had a flourishing educational experience. Brown versus Board was aimed to promote equity, because back then, Black schools were receiving a third of the funding. Their books were like 20 years outdated. It was just really, really awful. And so Brown versus Board aimed to create equitable learning experiences. And by default, that case promoted, hey, we have to mix races now because it's unconstitutional to separate them. These children, although they might have a smile on their face and are eager to learn, we know firsthand accounts that yes, they were included in the space, but that doesn't mean that they had a remarkable or even pleasant or positive learning experience, especially in the beginning. So to just say you're diverse to the first plantation picture is not enough. To just say you're inclusive is not enough, especially because you can find technicalities even when looking at these pictures. It's not enough. Okay, we're going to talk about equity next. And if we just take equity based on definition, we can pick apart that as well. Okay, equity. I should also have said trigger warning for anybody who has close relationships or ties to people in the criminal justice system. But equity, okay, we have this, from what I can tell, of course you can't assume gender, this looks like a group of men. They all have their hair cut low. They all look like they're eating the exact same thing for lunch. This is a picture of what equity would look like if we just talk about food resources and living conditions. Everyone lives in a climate where the temperature is controlled set. Let's just say it's a cool 69 degrees. Everyone goes to the same barber, eats from the same food tray, eats at the same time, has lights out at the same time, etc. To say you're just being equitable also does not mean that this is a condition that we should want to be in. If you take either one of these definitions in isolation, you can find tremendous problems with this. You can be diverse without being equitable. You can include people without being equitable. You can have equity and still not have an environment that is positive, that fosters a sense of belonging. So taking each one of these phrases in isolation is something that we should always challenge as educators and think, okay, we can't just write this in an email or a memo. We can't say that our department is doing these things if students do not feel like they belong, if we still see discrepancies in the data on who's graduating. We just really have to pick it apart and do better, because we could do, you know, I work in higher ed, and I just know there is so much more we could do than just lip service and putting it in an email that we are a diverse and equitable place. It's really looking at our practices, our hidden practices, our unspoken practices, to make sure that we are pushing the boundary of what diversity, equity, and inclusion means. So I asked you a trivia question at the beginning of the presentation. What does Star Wars have to do with this? There's still a problem with all the things that I said. And so this has led a lot of diversity and inclusion advocates like myself, facilitators of so many different trainings. We have found that there is a hidden or a missing component within all of this work. And so the answer to the question is, people have been advocating for what's called JEDI work, which is justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And justice is a heavy word. Some people don't like it, and we'll talk about a word you can use in replacement of that if the word justice brings a reaction that you don't really like. But justice, for the sake of this conversation, challenges who is in power, what are some things that we can do to maybe change the rules or adjust the policies that we have had for decades that is not serving everyone. It really looks at how is the institution serving, or what are ways that the institution, meaning Metropolitan Community College, in my case, Towson, what are the ways in which the institution or even our individual practices can really push the boundaries on making sure that it's not just an equitable place or a diverse place or a place that says it's inclusive, one that is really fighting for making sure that the rules and policies and procedures and standards and even the way that we interact with students is one where justice is allowed. And so I pulled a picture. I pulled one that tried to show a little bit of a difference. So in these pictures, these are from the Children's March in Brooklyn. I believe they were talking about like voting, and there was some Black Lives Matter signs, and they were advocating for different causes, but they allowed children to speak their voices and to advocate for a cause that mattered to them. So you see little kids of different races, you see, which promotes diversity. You see inclusive, meaning children were allowed to bring their voices. So kids weren't off in the back and the adults had them like, no, we include kids' voices too. So it was inclusive as well. Equitable, and I love the picture with the little stair step on the left. Equitable, meaning if you can't reach the microphone, I will make sure I provide the tools, which is equity. I'll provide the tools to which you can serve at the level that I am, in this case, a step stool. I will help you get to the microphone if you physically cannot get there. So it's equitable, but also justice in that it's not just a photo op. And I've been on, this is a shady comment, I've been on several university photo ops or brochures for our department. It's more than just a photo op. This was not, hey, children, let's come take a picture in Brooklyn because the weather is nice. It's no, let's use our voices to make sure that we speak out against practices that we know could be better, that we know could better serve our community. And so this is just a quick example of what justice would look like within diversity and inclusion work. Really quick, I want to just because I am a researcher, so I joke with people all of the time. I'm a proud millennial, and that comes with a lot of people roll their eyes at millennials. My dad often says that he's a proud boomer. He always says, Marcy, millennials, you all just love a cause. You pick apart everything. Nothing ever satisfies you. You protest, boycott, cancel everything. I'm a proud millennial. Also, I am a researcher, which means that I often have to find loopholes and research ways that we can change language better. For those two reasons that I just said, I want to offer critique in case anyone was thinking, why would you use the term JEDI for this work? Before you cancel my presentation, really quick, I do understand that some believe that Jedis are not appropriate mascots for social justice. My husband's a huge Star Wars fan. We do know that Star Wars, a lot of people critique it for colonizing space. Some people say the show is not very racially inclusive or equitable amongst genders. And people say that Star Wars promotes commercialization and commodification, which means basically that this work is more than just a baby Yoda. Like, you shouldn't just think that this is some cute thing. Thinking about justice and equity and inclusion is real work that you shouldn't just have a mascot to think about. So I am saying, before we keep going, that I do know that there are researchers that say, hey, I don't really like the term Jedi. Some people, if you look at the first bullet point, believe that belonging is a better word for versus justice in the beginning. For the sake of this presentation, we'll use justice, but just know, if you're thinking about when you take this back to your department, as long as you know to extend beyond diversity, equity, inclusion, something else. You can use belonging if that's something that works better for your department. If you work and like the term justice, you are welcome to use justice as well. And Jedi work is now the appropriate and widely used term within diversity and equity spaces. I just wanted to give you this PowerPoint because I do think that it's good to look at what are some of the critiques before we get going. So I'm not going to talk about Obi-Wan Kenobi. I'm not going to talk about different Star Wars characters. I just use this as a great acronym for the rest of the work that we're going to do. Okay, millennial moment done. So this is a great way. We're going to think about ways to take the work that we're doing or that we need to do and extend space for justice. And I'm going to show you different examples because I do think when you hear the word justice, you might think about court cases or police, or you might just think about things that have less to do with the work that we're doing. So I'm going to give you several examples of this. So diversity includes the different thoughts of peoples and perspective, diverse thoughts, diverse groups of people, etc. Equity is kind of like the stair step that I showed you on that last picture, is providing policies and practices that help to give tools to people that need them. Inclusion includes giving power and voice to those people who are often on the margins. You want to bring them into the fold. Justice is kind of the next step, and that's when you're talking about more equitable opportunities. I lost where you were. Okay, more equitable opportunities and rights for people. And there's room for this even in the work that we're doing in higher ed. And what I mean for that is we're really looking at some of the systems that we have in place, some of the rules, some of the department procedures that we have, and challenging how can we make these better on a systematic way. So this is, I'm just going to show you several examples of ways that justice can be included. So diversity, if we're thinking about a class, says there are many different people, identities, experiences, perspectives, approaches in my class. Okay, the next step says inclusion says, well, I invite valid, rational, non-dominant perspectives in my class. A word, a mouthful to basically says, well, I invite those perspectives that I don't see to come in my class. I make the effort to include, which is good, but there's so much more we could do. Equity says I address the biases that lead to some of these invisible perspectives in my class. So I address some of those things. I provide extra tools for those who might need them. And then justice, like I said, challenges the policies that enforce some of these invisible policies, or enforces dominance, or enforces the ways in which some students succeed, but other students just consistently, every year, if you pull the annual report, we keep seeing the same students not performing. Justice looks at that. I'm going to provide so many more examples. Okay. If you need to screenshot this, this is a good kind of thing to, I think I have something like this on my office wall on my little cork board, but diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice all work together. Like I said, we're looking at justice to also be included in our work, because we should think about how do we redistribute power. If we keep seeing that veteran students are not graduating at the same, or not transitioning in and out at the same rate as our other students, or all of our night students are not performing like our day students, or our single mothers program, our teen mothers program, whatever programs we have at Metropolitan Community College. If we keep seeing, if every annual report from the last 5 years keeps saying the same demographic group, justice is simply saying, who can we talk to? What rules can we change? Can we offer classes at a different time that would give our veteran students a better chance? Could we give them a summer seminar to get them on the right foot, because so many of them are coming back from combat? We have different age groups within this population. Could we offer a summer seminar before they start classes so that we the next annual report, we won't keep seeing that veteran students are not performing. That is what justice is saying. So I just want to keep reiterating, just because, like I said, justice is a word that makes some people feel like, I teach math. What does this have to do with justice? We can get to that later, but it just helps us think about ways that we can really, really make change. That is what justice is. Okay. I'm giving several examples just because I want all of us to be on the same page here. So, diversity asks, who's in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't. Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? We're trying to get people from the margins into our classes. Justice says, whose ideas won't be taken seriously because they're not the majority. And we can think about that in a second. Diversity asks, how many more, you think of how many more women do we have this year than last year? Equity responds, what conditions have we created that maintain certain groups to have the perpetual majority here? And that could be class offerings, et cetera. We can get to that in a second. Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? And then justice gives you a wordful, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimalized to allow others to continuously feel uncomfortable. And maybe that's, I often tell people this, if there's certain professors that chronically underperform for certain groups of students, maybe it's offering their classes at for different groups versus other professors where you see all the time on their course evaluations, this professor breaks it down so much. Oh my good, I don't know if you all do student evaluations like that, but maybe it's shifting courses. If everyone teaches Math 102 and you have 5 different instructors, maybe it's giving instructors, professors who are really, really, really doing a great job, the space to teach students, or it's teach sections of students or different demographics of students who need the extra help. So it's just shifting, and it's asking, how can we disrupt students or our community members that consistently feel like their views or their experience is not the same as everyone else's. A mouthful, but I still think it's valuable. Okay, I think I have like 1 or 2 more of these. I'm trying to like drill in that justice does belong in this work. Okay, this is like the last ones. I have like a couple slides of these. So like I said, diversity asks, who gets in the room? And then equity responds, who gets in the room, who can't, who's constantly under the pressure or threat of erasure. I think you can think about that in terms of when you think about different majors. I know that in many STEM fields, we keep saying that, oh, it's dominated by men, or, oh, we cannot get students of color to finish our high level math classes or our high level science classes. And so this shifts, instead of just saying who's in the room, and then on your department chair report, you say, oh, I have 70% men and 30% women, and they're, mostly white. You can say, you could just shift your thinking or have a new department meeting to really challenge who can't get in the room, who cannot pass this one math class that is the baseline for other math classes. Where are the loopholes in the system where we're seeing a lot of students fall off, who basically cannot get in the room? And when I say in the room, that could be in your major, in your program, on graduation day, who cannot get there based on the policies that we have. In the same way, inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice says, whose ideas won't be taken seriously because they're not in the majority. I think about this often in terms of student evaluations. So you could say, as a department chair, and I'm also an assistant department chair, so I don't mean to keep drilling on admin. I am now an admin, a thankless job, let me just say. A thankless job. I did not know I had to deal with so many parents, etc. So yes, I am in admin now, so I get it. Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? And you can basically say on student evaluations or on our faculty member surveys, yeah, we ask everyone to complete them. If they don't complete them, fine. But we have asked for everyone's ideas to be heard. But justice says, okay, instead of saying, yes, technically you did extend student evaluations to every student, you can say whose ideas won't be taken seriously because they're not the majority. Basically meaning, if you are seeing problems within your program, or if you're seeing loopholes or shortcomings within your program, how do we invite those students who maybe won't fill out a survey, who do not have time to fill out a course evaluation, to also make sure that their ideas are heard? Maybe that's at the end of class, you ask for a Post-it note before they walk out and say, hey, anything I could do differently in my teaching? Anything, when you have students who are matriculating to four-year programs and they're leaving Metropolitan Community College, maybe it's asking like, hey, if you could change anything, what would you change? If you could do anything differently, what would you do? And maybe they will say, hey, I don't think I should have to have taken this course at this time. You never know what you will get from students if you don't just, if you don't give the opportunity to ask beyond just a student evaluation. I think sometimes those informal conversations, or those kind of heart-to-heart conversations, often lend the real issues that we see within programs. Okay, so I'm going to skip the next ones. Hopefully I've drilled into you that justice does belong in this work. So I'm going to give some practical tips. Like I said, all four of these components are important. So I'm going to give some practical tips for looking at diversity within our work. So I'm going to take each one of these different groups out of the four, and we're going to talk about them. We're going to talk about the importance of diversity. I have some data to show that work in diversity is important. So I don't want you dismissing like, oh, I don't need to focus on diversity anymore. It's like, no, you do. We just know that that's a both and, diversity and all of these other things. So diversity. I say this on probably every presentation I do because I do think that this is so important. So we know that our classrooms are browning. That's just the best way to say that. Our classrooms are becoming more and more diverse. I think that fourth bullet point is one that I say so much. So well, let me go back to the third bullet point. So over the next 40 years, racial minorities, which is a term that's kind of outdated, but students of color will make up 64% of public school students. Okay, in 40 years, 64% of public school children. That is almost 2/3. Now, that fourth bullet point is one I say probably in every presentation. Also, because of the way the world is shifting, biracial and multiracial students will increase 226% over the next 40 years. So our classrooms are becoming more and more diverse, more and more brown, more and more non-white. And that's a fact. That's just longitudinal census data. This is from the US Census Department, by the way. And the second bullet point, by 2025, millennials will make up 75% of the workforce. Now that is just because of the way retirement works. And now millennials will become the dominant working class within our world. And what do I mean by all of this, and why are we talking about it? As we think about just the physical demographics of our students changing, we have to think about and embrace the fact that we will have different perspectives in our classrooms. Some that, if there's an age difference between you and your students, you will have students, many more of which will have a different worldview just by default in what generation they were born into. So millennials, we have Gen Z. I have a baby son, he's 8 months old. He's Generation Alpha, if that matters. As the world keeps going on, we will see students with different, from different age groups that we are. So like I said, I'm a proud millennial. I teach Generation Z. I think they are very different from millennials. I am trying to understand them every day, and I'm less than 10 years apart from them. So yes, it's not only thinking about black and white. I do understand that because I know this data, I will see students that look more and more diverse coming into my classroom. But I also have to grapple with that each class that comes in, we just welcomed a graduating class. Let me back up. The graduating class of this year could have been born in 2000. So the 3 years ago, excuse me, these freshmen were born into 2000. They do not remember 9/11, and they are getting ready to graduate college next year. So there are students who just have a completely different worldview. They have only known the world to be like it is today. And so it's embracing not only racial differences age differences, world outlook differences, etc. And that is important work, because often in diversity work, it gets focused just on race, and that is very important. But gender diversity in some majors is important. Age group differences is very important when we think about hiring practices coming up. As you think about new faculty to add, not only will you need a diverse racial group, you will also need diverse perspectives. So maybe hiring millennials or some Gen Zs who will help be more relatable to incoming classes of students is also very, very important. I said this before. So one of my favorite quotes is from Marian Wright Edelman. She's a famous Delta for Dr. Gooch Grayson. She is the president. She's the president emeritus now of the Children's Defense Fund. And I often talk about the chicken or the egg. So she has a famous quote. I think it's important. She says, quite simply, "You cannot be what you cannot see." And I do the chicken and the egg for us to question when we think about diversity, when we think about representation, when we think about children, students, adult students, and everywhere in between, wanting to grow up, wanting to contribute, go back to school and contribute better to our society. It is, and I think her quote is important, it is hard to, if you cannot be what you cannot see, it is hard for many of our students to even think about changing their careers, their majors, going back to school, completing their programs, if they do not see people in that same field, in that same program that identify with them. I think, yes, race is important with that. I said even before, I think age group is becoming important. I think making sure women are teaching some of our math classes and science classes, all of that is super important, because I share this all the time. When I taught in Atlanta, I had a student, his name was Jordan. Jordan, I taught language arts and they rotated on the same hall. So my group always came from the math class. So Jordan walked in, he swore he was the thug and he had braces. And I used to tell him all the time, "Jordan, you can't be a thug with braces. That's not how it works." But he just swore he was the hardest person ever, just a peanut, scrawny little boy. Walked in my class just beaming one day, braces shining from ear to ear. And he was carrying a piece of paper and he scored really, really good on his math test. This is 7th grade. And so he walked in and he was just, usually he's kind of really removed and trying to be too cool for school. That was just Jordan. And so he walked in beaming one day. And I said, "Jordan, what happened?" And I could tell he was just really proud of his math test. He must have done really, really well on it. And I made the statement, "Jordan, one day you're going to be an astrophysicist. Just keep it up. You're doing great in math." And he turned to me as sure as today is Friday and said, "Miss Watts," I was Miss Watson back then, "Miss Watson, Black people can't be astronauts. What are you talking about?" A remarkable example to say, and yes, he was misguided. We do know that there are Black astronauts, but I do think Jordan so poetically said basically the inverse of what Miss Marian Wright Edelman said, and that is, if you cannot be what you cannot see, if you do not know sitting in some of our classes that you even have the chance to be in some of these careers, maybe we as an institution, this is where justice starts to come in, maybe we as an institution should think about how are we making sure that our faculty and staff are diverse in representation? Yes, involving race, but even beyond race, how are we making sure that we are setting examples and providing a physical representation of what these children can grow up and be? And so maybe your department is solid, you really don't need to diversify. Maybe it's thinking about guest speakers who can come in, especially generationally. Maybe if you're doing if your math department is just solid, you're like, "Marcy, everything you're saying sounds great. This is really cute, but our math department is solid." That's fine. Maybe it's thinking about, for the next speaker series, bringing in some young dynamic professors who teach math, for them to just see, like, "Hey, I have a PhD in applied mathematics." For them to just see someone who looks like them, who took a career in math and pivoted and found research and engaging work, maybe robotics, thinking about different ways to really make learning engaging, but also relatable to students. That's so important. I have more data that basically shows, this was the University of Michigan's study, that basically says that when students were in educational settings among racially and ethnically diverse students. Students felt more engaged, more motivated to study, had stronger critical thinking, stronger problem solving, and stronger writing skills, which I think is important as we think. And I do know also what it's like to be on faculty, and you just think student caliber, the caliber of work is not the same. Students are just not trying as hard, all of that. I think this was a great study to highlight in that we see stronger evidences of content mastery, stronger student performance when students are in classrooms that are more heterogeneous, that have different ways of thinking. And if you think about it, that makes more sense. If every student is of the homogeneous background, there's not a lot of different ways to bounce ideas off the walls that would provide different experiences, especially in some of our humanities classes, sociology, all of that. It is so, so, so important to hear from perspectives that you do not know, that you're not familiar with. That provides stronger critical thinking, stronger problem solving skills, in that you were having to defend your answer against someone that you thought maybe had a different perspective. You are now disrupting some of those stereotypes that you might have had. All of that is very important. This was a comparative study for all of the social scientists. They can compare different cohorts of students from heterogeneous and homogeneous populations, and found that students in diverse groups perform better in these areas, for all of the data people out there listening. And then last one, I think, before we move on to the next demographic, 5 years ago, the US Department of Education showed that students experience less discrimination and bias, and overall have a better learning experience when they perceive that there is a strong institutional commitment to diversity. And this extends beyond statements and emails and annual reports, which, like I said, now being a part of administration, I do understand the importance of that. Funding is tied to it. You need it for accreditation purposes. I get that. Strong institutional commitments to diversity, however, are much more on the ground examples. They're not just the statements we write or our nice, clean emails. It's beyond that. It's showing, not just saying, how we are committed to diversity. So that is hiring practices, recruitment practices, etc. Okay, I think that I will, we could do this really quick. This just came out this year, so I guess it's worth saying it. Diverse teacher representation helps students in all of the following ways. This also makes sense if you think back 2 slides with the University of Michigan. Diversity of thought, helping students understand and confront racism, living in a multicultural society, less interactions with cultural bias, etc. This came from teachers who they call it cultural mismatch, but it basically means when there's incongruence between the teacher's demographic and the student's demographic. And we see this, we will continue to see this, like I said, with the data that I showed, as our classrooms continue to diversify. But diverse teacher representation helps students in the following ways. And this was by the National Bureau of Economic Research. So thinking about hiring practices, once again, this is important. Not just for faculty, but staff. I should keep saying that. I keep talking about faculty, but for staff as well. Okay, I want to say this before we move on. Diversity is, we're going to talk about what diversity is and what it isn't really quick as you're thinking about your department or your office. Diversity is, a person can't be diverse. I am African American, as you can see. I call myself young and I identify as a woman, but I am not diverse. Me, in comparison to everyone on this call, our Zoom call right now is something that is diverse. So a group is diverse, a department is diverse, more than one person together is something that is diverse, but a person is not diverse. So I think just even thinking about language, saying we don't need to recruit diverse students. Like, we don't need to recruit a student who is diverse. We need to recruit students who are of diverse backgrounds. We need to recruit a diverse group of students, but an individual student is not diverse. So that is something to keep in mind if we're talking about language and why is it important. If a young football player walks in your office and he's of Latino background, you can't say, oh, I talked to one of my diverse students today. It's like, no, your student is just Latino, like, and very proudly Latino, and he should be. But is your interaction with that student, if you think about the students in your classroom as a collective body, is that diverse? A group can be diverse, a person cannot be diverse. And then I just want to also say this, because often, like I said, race gets the forefront of so many discussions with this, but there are visible forms of diversity, and then there are also forms of diversity that we will never see. So someone's religion, which is super important to who they are as a person, helps to make them someone that is unique, but that may not be something you can outwardly see. Or their veteran status is something that's very important, even for, especially for colleges, when we talk about groups of students that need a little extra care, but that may not be something you can outwardly see. And so I mentioned if you look at the bullet points, these are different diversity markers. Sexuality is another one. You can't outwardly see that on some people. So these are some identity markers to keep in mind when you are thinking about recruiting or trying to engage with or help students. You may not always get to see like race or like certain, like race, sometimes gender and ability, people's diverse needs, but you will, but these are important as well. Okay, inclusion. We're going to move on to inclusion. That was so much for diversity, but inclusion, I think getting the right language is important. So we have the right language. So inclusion. This, I always say this, I should have also given a trigger warning on the right-hand side, but I think one way that our departments, our college, our offices, our admin, it doesn't matter, can be more inclusive is to move beyond heroes and holidays. Making sure that beyond Women's History Month, that women in your department feel like they have an equal voice in decisions being made, etc. Making sure beyond Black History Month or Hispanic Heritage Month, and then there's different days. I'm sure today is like, I don't know, peppermint cookie day or something. Beyond these different days, I made that up. Beyond these different days and weeks and months, making sure that beyond those focused times that we move beyond heroes and holiday. And I put the pictures on the right because we see students, classrooms. I did K-12 just to, as something we can all reference and have memories of. Often when you do these narrow programs, you run the risk often of not doing it correctly or in an inclusive way. And so making sure that you're intentional with your inclusion, moving beyond a pilgrim hat and a feather or Cinco de Mayo and putting offensive mustaches on children. In a K-12 setting, these are some of the examples they see, but in higher ed settings beyond Pride Week or Pride Month, making sure that your LGBTQIA+ students feel like they have access to the right bathroom, that they have access to the right pronoun usage, etc. So that is something that I think is super important. I also think that as you're thinking about teaching some of your courses, I say this, like I said, I teach college kids how to be teachers. I often also think about the way history has been framed. I think it's important to recognize that many students of color, many non-white students, only learned about their history in school based on a lot of narrow moments. Like, so for African Americans, it was often slavery and the civil rights movement. I do know Nebraska, in comparison to other states, we did spend quite a bit of time on Native American history, but not nearly as much as it should have been. So we learned about the LaCroix and the Sioux. We did an art class, etc. I do remember those, but Asian American history, I did not learn that. And I was a product of Omaha public schools as well. So why am I saying all this? It's important when we think about programs that we offer, student-centered organizations and programming, or even classes that we offer, making sure that we provide some of these gaps and loopholes that they may not have gotten in their K-12 education. I think that is a way to make sure that we extend the conversation just beyond talking about diversity and inclusion and really being inclusive. And so maybe it's having a student group where Asian students can collectively gather and also plan the programming for the whole campus to enjoy. I think that is really important. So critical race theory is getting a lot of attention today. I think this, I'll pick my words very carefully. I think in the height of all of the conversations that's happening, and I do know that it's very politically divisive right now, meaning people either strongly love it or they strongly hate it. What I will say is that regardless of how you feel about this theory, it's important to always embrace some of these difficult conversations. And it may not be on race. I did this because I think it would be foolish not to mention some of the headlines that are happening in the world. And we're talking about it in my classes because they're going to be teachers and they don't know how to talk about race, et cetera. I think beyond race, we can kind of zoom out, not just critical race theory, but just zoom out. Having difficult conversations is important to have in the classroom, not only with our kids, and it doesn't have to be about race, but talking about gender and pronouns is really difficult for older generations maybe to talk about, or if you don't feel like in your engineering class or in your science class, if there's any room to talk about diverse perspectives, I think that it's important to give students the tools to have these difficult conversations. And the one thing I will say in relation to this as well, and then we'll move on quickly, because I know, like I said, people feel very strongly about this. And I do think that in height of all of this happening, I think it's good that a lot of these conversations are at least happening. It's investigating what has been maybe challenged or banned or problematized in your field and allowing students to explore for that themselves. And I will just pivot from that. And I listed 3 books that I read actually in Omaha Public Schools. I remember a big Native Son project and when I was, before I graduated. Anyway, saying all that to say, some of these books are now being challenged, and knowing that maybe in your classrooms, depending on how policies will be written in the next couple of years, that what happens at the K-12 level, maybe giving space in higher education to allow students to investigate some of these more difficult topics. If at K-12 parents decide that that's something they're uncomfortable with, allowing some of this to be discussed in your classroom just for sake of exploration. So I'll move on. Okay, importance of language. The last thing I'll say with inclusion is making sure that you use the right pronouns. I think that's something that is an everyday practice that can make people feel more inclusive. Also, challenging jargon is something that when I'm in admin meetings, it blows me away only because I haven't sat to think about it, but that's just a blinder that I have. Using jargon, using terms, and making sure that your language is not gendered. So instead of saying, hey, boys and girls, or men and women, you can say hello, folks, or hey, friends, or hey, students. Using language that doesn't necessarily gender people is important. Instead of saying if he or she disagrees with this policy, just saying, hey, for any student that disagrees with this policy, they can do this. I think that is something that is a small gesture, but makes people feel very included. And then last thing, I was gonna say, well, I could do this. I'm gonna share a 10 really quick inclusive practices. I'm trying to be mindful of time that you could do to show your appreciation for diversity. So one, making sure that your course reflects a diverse society and world. So the textbooks that you offer, the public speakers that you bring in, making sure that they are diverse, they offer, diverse perspectives. 2, setting up expectations that allow for valuing diverse viewpoints. So even if it's in your class that you don't mind debate, or you don't mind students offering something that maybe contradicts everything you might think as an educator, allowing students to provide their viewpoints helps to show that you embrace diversity. And this comes in, like I said, with these generational differences with students. Ensure that classroom media are accessible. That's important. I think YouTube offers free closed captions if you record your video, if you want to record a lecture for your class. You can do it on YouTube, save the link, and they do the closed captioning for free. Ensure that your syllabus sets the tone for diversity and inclusion is also important. Use inclusive language, making sure that you share your pronouns if that's something you want to do. But if nothing else, for students who do have non-dominant pronouns or ones that are not cisgendered, that you allow space for them to share their pronouns is a way to make sure that you embrace diversity and inclusion in your classroom. And then the last ones, I think this is just good teaching, good practice. If you have an office of all adults and you're not a teacher, you're staff, just introduction activities is important when you onboard someone new, allowing them to get to know the team, new students, first day of class, getting to really know students. I already said maybe 8 slides ago that those types of interaction help to promote critical thinking. And then offer, the last one is just practical for all the faculty, even staff, because staff have office hours as well, offering inclusive office hours. If you're thinking about students falling through the cracks, thinking about, am I open to having an evening office time if I know that connects with more of my students? Equity, I'm moving through these quickly because I do want to allow for questions. So I'm going to zoom through the rest. The biggest thing with equity is just challenging deficit thinking. Deficit thinking is a term that we use in education that describes how we look at certain groups like they are lacking qualities, if like they are not performing the way you would want them to. So if we, one thing you could do, a practical take-home thing you could do is just challenge deficit thinking. And that is removing labels like at risk. A student's not, removing that kind of label from a student so that they can have just a fighting chance without already having a negative term associated with them. Deficit thinking focuses on what knowledge they should have, like, oh, these children, they just didn't learn it then, and blah, blah, blah. Instead of using deficit language, like what they or their communities should have taught them, or they just don't know any better, because just thinking about how we think about some students, some demographics, like they don't have enough to perform. And instead of deficit thinking, we should think more about equity-minded thinking. And that is, instead of having these preconceived notions about students or different demographic groups, thinking about the data, looking at the data, and looking at ways that you can continue to promote equity based on data, not on preconceived notions and stereotypes. And, oh, students from this high school often need so much more work and blah, blah. Instead of thinking about it in a deficit, letting the data speak for itself. You might find that students from this high school do need more work, but it's challenging your thinking to at least look at the data first and not your own deficit assumptions about certain high schools in North Omaha or South Omaha, et cetera. Okay, and then justice, the last one, ways to promote justice in your classroom. There are different ways, but some implicit issues is just thinking about microaggressions and implicit bias. Microaggression just means those everyday little kind of, it's not overt racism or sexism, it's just things that are said or not said on a very, very small scale that doesn't promote equity. For example, it's when you mispronounce a student's name, or you, for a student with maybe a non-American name, you stumble across it, or can I just call you Jay for short? It's like, no, you can actually learn their name because that's the name that they want to go by. Policy issues, I often tell people to look at the spoken and unspoken rules. Think about activities and events planned. What times of day are they offered? Think about some institutional ways that you can address some of this. And then systemic, examining which ways, examining the ways in which people are excluded or excluded from certain groups. If you keep seeing that you're not getting students of color or immigrant students in high-level math classes, maybe examining the ways in which there might be policies that prevent students from getting in those classes. So maybe it's having, I don't know, a language interpreter, or having someone maybe at the more basic level math classes that provide more tutoring. It may be that the students just need like an extra little bump in tutoring before they get to your class. It may just not be that they just can't perform. It might be that there needs to be some policy, some actual institutional things that are embedded into the program to better help students. I think there's like one more thing I wanted to say. There are different questions you can ask. I'm zooming through this because I want to give time for questions. There are some important questions you can ask if you are in admin or on the staff level. You can also think about these. Do you routinely examine and report racial, ethnic? You can think of other diversities as well, participation in, and these are different groups you can think about, honors programs, graduation, etc. Think about, do we routinely report this information? Okay. Another important question you can ask is, does your campus have goals that are explicitly stated by race and ethnicity to improve these statistics? So the first one was, do we report these? Like, do we have a way of finding out this information? Two is, do you have goals? Has admin, has higher ups outline goals for each department to maybe get to? Third one, are you familiar with campus recruitment and admission? Is there a racial and ethnic map of high schools where recruitment takes place? This one is important. I would also even say, based on discipline, this can also show where like the pipeline to these schools is something to also look at. I can skip over some of these. Basically looking at our faculty and staff routinely evaluated. Or the fifth one is one that my university is doing. It may not be as applicable to you all, but we're actually having to report when we have a job posting, how many people apply, of what, you know, what diverse, what ethnic background they might be, who is selected for interview, who is not selected, and why. So really looking at, to make sure that we're not gatekeeping and hiring the same type of person. Are we denying qualified applicants based on certain things? And then have we looked at implicit bias, which I think is a department thing that is very important to look at, some of the biases that each discipline might have. So this is my closing. I just tell people in this line of work, even for most of us who just want to maybe think about this differently, or definitely know that our departments can do better, I just tell people to truly try to be more inclusive and don't fall for the buzzwords. After every national tragedy, you will see corporations say they are committed to inclusion or justice, or we want to welcome all into our store. And we at, I'm trying to think, what's the grocery store? Hy-Vee. We have Kroger in the South. We at Hy-Vee are committed to all people and blah, 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 blah. I'm making this up. But beyond those statements that any corporation can write, that Metropolitan Community College can write, really trying to be inclusive. And so you can look at the graphic yourself, thinking about what practices and policies are explicitly outlined that include or exclude people. What are some hidden practices? Meaning, what are some things that we're not telling certain students, but we assume for others? And then no basically means, what are some things we're not saying that we should be saying to really, really foster a sense of inclusion, equity, diversity, and also justice. If you don't like the word justice, belonging as well. Last thing is this. This was us during Halloween this past year. I just want to share my baby like any new mom. May the force be with you. I will now take questions. I could stare at this all day. I know.
Thank you, Dr. Vandiver. Thank you. That was a lot to think about and a lot to act upon. I have one question so far. If you would all put your questions in the chat to me, I will take them, read them as they come in. So one question that came in already is, thank you for mentioning that we should not be saying, can I just call you, I'll use me for example, Cindy instead of Cynthia. I don't have much of a diverse background, but have always bristled when I hear people say that. We should definitely be careful to learn a person's full name and correct pronunciation. So more of a statement. And another one just came in. when you do see a name that you cannot pronounce, is it okay to ask them to pronounce it for you?
Yes, multiple times, even multiple times. I have had students, I've had this situation happen every semester. Often I get a name that I trip up on. I have them repeat it and say, can you say it one more time? I'll write the phonetic spelling on I bring a physical roster to class. I write the phonetic spelling down, and I will say, and this is not offensive, you can say, it's going to take me a while to get it, but I really want to say your name. That's such a fun name. Like affirming that it's fun, not different, not strange, or ooh, that's a hard one, or I don't know. Making sure you remove the deficit language. I just said it, but just saying, yeah, that's super, very fun name. I'm going to get it, but work with me if I mispronounce it. Always stop me if I mispronounce it. Letting them know that it's a work in progress is more than fine.
Thank you.
Sure,
Any
sure.
other questions? Thank you for always saying, oh, here's one. Thank you for always saying yes when we ask. Here's one, too. Do you find encouragement in the openness of your students as future teachers? Excellent.
Do I find encouragement in how open they are?
Uh-huh.
Mm,
Or yeah.
I'm trying to understand the question. Are we talking about them being like a different demographic, like how open Generation Z is, or is that not the question? Like how open they are?
I'm not sure, but I think they mean in receiving what you're, as compared to previous generations.
Oh, huh. Yes. Answer yes, end of sentence for sure. Very open, very willing to talk about. Actually should have mentioned this. I've noticed with Generation Z, they have no problem talking about mental health and their importance of mental. I get so many emails saying, I am stressed. I am going to take a mental. They will assert how important their mental health is. So yes, I find them open. I also find that they are open, aware physically and mentally of just their own capacity, which is really, really interesting. I actually think certain generations could learn from them, including myself. They will tell me without hesitation, this is going to be a lot and I need to really focus on my mental health right now. And I think there's something really admirable about that. In relation to diversity work, yes, I think they're hungry to learn about it. A lot of them come from homogenous, suburban, high schools that they grew up with, and they're seeing the world as different and diverse. And I think they want to just better understand it. They also don't want to, in the age of going viral, they don't want to go viral for doing something racist. And they'll say that. They're like, I don't want to plan a lesson. And I'm thinking I'm doing something great during Black History Month and it's about slavery. I'm white. I don't want to be that viral TikTok video where it goes viral and people are dragging me on Instagram. And so I think for that reason, people laugh about social media. It has made them more aware on, I do not want to say the wrong things. Help me be a more inclusive educator. So yes, yeah, definitely open for sure.
Some more questions have come in. Thank you. I really enjoyed this. How does Towson report out success metrics by demographics and engage in conversation?
They have a whole office dedicated to it. It's like the Office of Institutional Data or something like that. But so you can, any faculty member, any student even can ask for a data from you can ask for certain data points. So I can email them right now and say, can I have all the demographics of every graduating person from this department over the last 10 years? And it's like a part of like the institutional agreement, they have to provide it. I think it's a way to be transparent. So Towson might be a specific case. Towson has an office, to your question, that reports this. If you're thinking about having a department that better reports this, I think that the Office of Admissions has a lot of data that people need. I would start with the Office of Admissions and making sure that with each graduating class, I don't know if it's not exit interviews, it's not HR, I'm trying to think of a better word, having some sort of exit process where you're gathering data. And hopefully, I would assume the institution has that kind of stuff. If not, the percentage of people that are graduating on time or transitioning out on time. So yeah, I think working with the Office of Admissions and your own individual department would be important.
Okay, I have 4 more questions that have come in. Dr. Vandiver, your presentation was earth-shattering. I appreciate your statement that good teaching isn't necessarily tied to a certain race. How do you help your students become aware of any deficit-based thoughts that they may hold?
I think that's a lifelong process. I really think that's a lifelong process. I think that the instructor, meaning you or whoever wrote the question, being transparent about your own privilege, and we all have them. Being aware of your own privileges is important, letting them know that it's a lifelong process, trying to be a dynamic educator, lifelong process. It's not without mistake. I think that the tangible things you could teach anybody is to recognize the importance of never stop learning about yourself and your students, being aware repeatedly of your own privileges, and we all have them. Who are you bringing into that space is important to be aware of. And then just teach with love, I think, is also something important. I think regardless of what the teacher looks like and the student looks like, you cannot learn from someone you know doesn't love you or can't stand you. Why would you want to learn? I don't go to doctors where I can tell they don't like me. I just switch. If I can't go to a doctor for 15 minutes for that, there's no way a student would sit through your classroom and they know I can't stand you and you can't stand me and you're a pain. So just, yeah, those 3 things I think are the starting points, and it's a lifelong process.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Can you give us some ideas on how not to fall into the trend of being performative about diversity?
Hmm. Hmm. I think that I hope higher level admin is not on this call. I do think I say often, make sure that your commitment to diversity, you can have a commitment, and I think it's important. You could write the nice email, that's important too, but also having funding for these things is important. So I think pushing whoever is in charge to provide funding or make space for in next year's budget, money funding programming to support these initiatives, that is important. I think that is what I would say if you want to push just the lip service that everyone has. If you want to push lip service, I would ask your department chair or the program officer, if not room for this year, how can we do these things next year? How can we have a program for our young moms, our veterans, et cetera, our immigrant students? Yes. Can we have programming to support this next year? Can we hire someone? Is there room in the budget to hire someone to meet this need next year? I think following the money is one great way to make sure that we're doing something beyond just what's on a nice email.
Thank you. How valuable
Sure.
is it to share our own non-visible identity markers in the classroom?
I think you can share whatever you feel comfortable with. Now, I should have also said on that slide, when I had the bullet points on the right-hand slide, for those of you who are thinking back, students and you as well should not have to disclose all of them. So like asking someone what's your sexual preference might be wildly inappropriate to ask. So I think you can share as much as you want to. I have a colleague who, he's a white guy. You would never, he's cisgender, which means that he's a guy who he identifies as masculine as well, but he chooses to disclose to his students, hey, I'm a gay guy, I grew up in rural Pennsylvania, he identifies as conservative. So he shares all of these things so that students know which lens he's coming through, which he uses in his teaching. Like he uses some of these demographic indicators to disrupt what they might have thought about him, and then he leads with that in the way that he teaches, and it works out really, really well for him. So I think you can disclose as much as you feel comfortable with, and I would only expect students to share what they're comfortable with as well. So asking them to disclose some of those private things, immigration status, sexuality, religion, it's just not appropriate.
Thank you. Last question. Do you have any recommendations for parents raising young children like yours? I threw the like yours in, and helping them to contribute to inclusive and just communities?
to contribute to inclusive communities. I'm assuming, okay, I think that one thing you can do, two things. One thing, if you have, this comes with a lot of assumptions that you have the time in the day to do this, or that your work schedule will allow this, but having a meal together with your child is super important. I don't want to say family because I think having whatever way that works. Some people it's dinner, some people have breakfast on, it may not happen every day. I definitely think daily would be great, but even if it's every Saturday, I don't have to go to work, so we can have Saturday breakfast, whatever. Just having touch points with your children over a meal is really, really important, because you find out in those small conversations who their friends are, what their friends are saying. You find out when they get adolescent, which viral video, like, especially if you allow for that open communication. The reason why I think that's important, and research does also back this, of course it does, but it's important because you can kind of see where some of their biases might be starting to form. It's through these conversations. And I think food is a great way to broker it. People get really comfortable when they're eating. You can hear, are they using the right language when they're talking about people? Or they're saying those people over there, I don't want to be friends with him. You can kind of see where maybe some of their implicit biases might be forming. That is a great way of starting that conversation. And then the second thing is always making sure that you are aware of stereotypes about people, and making sure that you're helping to disrupt that, not in an annoying way, but in a way such as, if you know your child, or just Americans in general, have an assumption that all immigrants come from Central and South America. The next time you all are watching the news, or you hear something, or I don't know, you can say, I don't know, I was going to say Justin Bieber, that's a horrible example, but the next time you hear of an immigrant that's not from one of those places, you could say, oh, I think they're an immigrant. I'm trying to think of a great example. I don't have one. Maybe an athlete that they love or something like that. Also that helps to disrupt it, so that they're not left with this ingrained knowledge like, oh, only people from Central or South America can be immigrants. This is just one example. Helping to disrupt that is also important. So those two things I would say are very, 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 very priceless things that you could do with your child. Being aware of stereotypes and having a meal with them. If you can't do it every day, try to hit it every week, where you can just maybe hear what they're thinking about their teacher, their classmates, school, the kids who sit in the back of the class. That is a way to kind of help to disrupt that. Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. And again, thank you
Bye.
everyone.
Go eat.
Being
Lunchtime.
here.
Yeah.
And happy winter quarter, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.